go ahead and do this here. Okay, I'm Dr. William Mansbach. Nice to be with you this evening. We're going to focus on communication tips for engaging loved ones and others who have significant cognitive impairment, especially dementia. I'll present information on what we call the grade 8, which are really, I think, tips or things not to do in order to lower agitation in someone who has dementia, but really to be facilitative of a better connection in some way. There are a few things that are more disappointing and sometimes hurtful than to be with a loved one who has dementia, who becomes agitated and sometimes even aggressive, who perhaps doesn't recognize us or relates to us in a way that was not how we had intended. What we know about these grade 8 tips is that they lower what we call the BPSDs. That's just sort of psych speak for the behavioral and psychological symptoms of dementia, dementia-related behaviors. So let me go ahead and get started, and I'm going to find a PowerPoint here. And a little housekeeping, let me just make sure that we all can see it. Give me a second here, and I will go ahead and start. What I hope is from the beginning. Okay, can you see my screen? Try this again. Oops. Okay. Kayla, can you see the screen there where it says grade 8 communication tips?
Yep, we're good.
Okay, all right, so we'll go ahead and get started. As I said, I'm from the BCAT Research Center and Counterpoint Health Services. I'm going to talk in the very beginning about just communication in general. Communication can be intentional. We want to engage someone who we care about or someone in which we want to spend some time through an activity or a conversation, but it can also be unintentional. That is, things can happen that we didn't really think through. And with dementia, that becomes very blurred or blended in some ways. And there are reasons for that that are neurophysiological. And all I mean by that is that language, how we hear language and how we express language, what's called receptive language and expressive language, they get compromised in dementia, most dementias, but certainly dementia of the Alzheimer's type. So as you may know, Alzheimer's disease is one of the most common causes of dementia. Dementia is a syndrome, it's not a disease. It can be caused by 10 or 11 different diseases. The three most common are Alzheimer's disease, vascular dementia, that's caused by strokes, and then third is a combination of both of those, but there are others as well. So it's a true statement to say visual memories stay in place much longer than auditory ones. So it's very important that when we engage a loved one who has dementia, that we think about it that this is someone who has communication challenges. And so it's important that we get a person's attention before we start, kind of check to make sure that eye contact is being made before we start talking. I will also say, and this won't be the first time I say this, that it's important that you know that you chunk your words into small phrases or sentences. I'm going to be talking about something called working memory. It's a technical term, but I'll make it very clear in just a moment or two. But really, by chunking words, you should be using, for people who have moderate stage dementia or more advanced dementia, sentences that have 5 or 6 words, no more than that. That's going to be important, and I'll explain why that is in a moment. So as I go through this, you should be thinking about how you communicate with a loved one who has dementia. Look before speaking. What I mean by that is, think about it in this way. If you were going to cross the street, what did you learn when you were a child? Look both ways, right? Why did you learn that? You learn that because it can be dangerous if you don't look, because there could be a car that's coming in some ways. Strangely, I'm reminded of that when I talk about looking before speaking with dementia. But now what you're looking for is the person with dementia, are they paying attention? Are they paying attention to me? Is there a clear channel, an open channel without noise or traffic, so to speak, coming through? That's important. Also, as I talk about the Great 8 communication tips, there's a 12-minute video. We can make it available for you. It's free. It's used very widely. It's just sort of a way of sharing. We can give it to you through a link if you want with family members or others, sort of the do's and don'ts of communicating with someone who has dementia. So I'm going to get right into the Great 8. And the first one is to speak at a normal pace, not a slow pace. Quite often you'll see people talking to either a resident, a client, a family member, speaking very slowly to make sure that they're understood. The problem with that is that it runs into the working memory problem. So here's what working memory really is. Working memory, we all have this. It is the temporary storage. It's kind of the sketch pad that we have for storing new information that comes at us, either information that we hear, information that we see, information that we process in some ways. For most people, working memory lasts about 30 seconds. And if you think about it in very practical terms, if you wanted to make a new memory, you have about 30 seconds to start to commit to making that memory. And if you wait longer than that, you won't be able to learn something new. So an example that we often do is if I gave you a telephone number, 10 digits, and I said, I want you to memorize this telephone number, it would take me about 10 seconds to say the 10 digits, but you have only 30 seconds to commit it to memory. And if you wait 30 seconds and then try to remember it, you won't be able to do it. So if I said the numbers 301 574 6951, and I asked you to read or pay attention to television or something for 30 seconds and then remember that phone number, you wouldn't be able to do it. Under almost all, certainly rare circumstances, would you be able to do it. So people with dementia could be living with working memory that might be 5 to 7 seconds. And if you use the rule of thumb 5 seconds, what that means is that if you're talking and you use words that have more than 5, 6, certainly 7 words to them, your loved one might not remember the first word or the second word of your sentence and get confused. And once that confusion starts, it's kind of like a rock rolling down a hill. It just gathers speed and it can make someone agitated. So speaking at a normal pace is important because if you speak too slowly, you're going to exceed a person's working memory capacity. Okay. The second point is lead with your main point. This is a tip that you might want to think about quite often when you're talking with a loved one with dementia. And you'll find that quite often you don't do it. So leading with your main point puts a lot less stress. The demands are less on working memory. So it's all about working memory. So you don't want a loved one to have to wait to get to the main point, because by the time you get to the main point, working memory may have already been exceeded. So here's an example. Although these are sort of reversed as I see it, you wouldn't want to say, sit here to eat your dinner. You'd want to say, eat your dinner here. It says, they're actually reversed. It should be, the first one should be do say and the second should be don't say. So we talk about that as left branching sentences. it's important to start with your main point and try to get it in 5 words or less if you can. The third one is pretty obvious, but often not respected, and that is to minimize background noise. So why is that? People with dementia have what we describe as a compressed or reduced stimulus buffer. And what we mean by that is we are constantly taking in information. You're doing it now, I'm doing it now, everyone's doing it, but we don't pay attention to a lot of it. We screen it out. So it doesn't really demand very much of us. So for example, if I said, have you been paying attention to your feet on the ground? You'd probably say, well, no, but your brain has. And if you're wearing glasses, and if I said, well, have you been feeling the glasses on your face before I direct your attention to it? For most of you, you would say no, right? So the ability to do that, it's a prefrontal, if you look at my forehead right here, executive skill. People with dementia lose the ability to do that, so they're easily distracted by a stimulus buffer that's overwhelming. And so when there's a lot of background noise, that kind of loads up that stimulus buffer. So if you want to have a conversation with a loved one with dementia without that person getting agitated, and to help protect working memory, try to have the conversation in a quieter place. Turn the television down, for example, or have fewer people talking at the same time. You know, I was invited a couple of months ago to a dinner at a friend's house, and my wife and I went, and they had their parents there visiting, and the mother had, I would say, moderate stage Alzheimer's disease, and we were at a dinner table, and everyone was talking at once, and I sat back thinking, there's no way this person's going to be able to process information. So that's important. And even if that wasn't the case, think about this. Approximately a third of people 65 to 75. So now we're talking about younger people mostly, right? Younger, older people. I don't think 65 to 75 is very old, but a third of them have meaningful hearing loss. And if you go up to the next cohort, aging cohort, you're looking at 40 to 45%. So think about this. If you don't hear very well and you're straining and there's a lot of background noise, that's really a problem. So that's why we minimize background noise. The next one is matching your body language with what you're saying, making sure that your physical gestures don't contrast your language, but actually that they are in sync, that they support one another. If your body says one thing and your words say something else, that can be very confusing for any of us, but especially if you have dementia, because one of the symptoms of dementia is difficulty decoding behavior. So when it's simple, that really helps. When it's not simple, it's pretty complicated. We talk about it as avoiding disconnects. So if you're talking to someone, you should be facing them. You shouldn't be walking away, as an example. If something's important, you should be leaning forward. That would be an example of a gesture and words being in sync in some ways. And certainly give your listener, your loved one with dementia, your undivided attention, which is hard to do when you're trying to multitask or do 2 different things at the same time. Just remember, your person with dementia has difficulty decoding physical behavior, right? So you need to help with that. So next, we talk about mirroring the listener. Sometimes we describe it in this way. We say eyes to eyes and lips to lips, and you'll see what I mean in a moment. You want to mirror the actual body position of your listener. And if you do that, it actually reduces noise, psychologically, but it opens that channel of communication much better. So make sure you're face-to-face with a person, directly in front of the listener. If she is sitting, you are sitting. So if she's in a wheelchair, find your own chair. Don't stand up over a person and just assume that they're going to be able to make sense of it. If she's standing, you are standing. So one way to think about all these tips is that because working memory is short, you're trying to reduce the likelihood of agitation. And not only that, you want to increase the likelihood that your family member or loved one is connected to you in some ways. And to do that, mirroring becomes a really important strategy. I think this one won't surprise you. And the idea is to be direct and, obviously, as I've talked about, brief. Use these short, concrete statements. Metaphors, as lovely as they are and as clever as they can be, are often not going to be well received because a person's ability to do abstraction is impaired. So, for example, we know this when we assess a person who has, let's say, Alzheimer's disease, and we administer a test called the BCAT, which is a multifactorial cognitive test, a best of class way of identifying, does a person have dementia? What are their memory abilities? What are their executive abilities, and many other things. And there's an item in there where we ask a resident in what ways things are alike, like in what ways are an apple and an orange alike. That's pretty simple, right? In what ways are a boat and a train alike? That's a little bit more abstract. In what ways are a newspaper and a book alike? And so forth. So they're increasingly more complex in terms of abstraction. And so with dementia, a person becomes more concrete and less ability to experience or make sense of abstraction or metaphor or things of that sort. Now, you could be sitting there and saying, well, you know, my mom or my dad or my brother or sister or whomever is still able to do all these things. And some people are. Not everyone progresses at the same rate, but it is inevitable for illnesses like Alzheimer's disease that a person over time does become more concrete, does have more difficulty. So that's important. So don't say, we don't want you to wake up at night, so take your pills before you go to bed. That's already way too many words. It's too vague. Take your pills at night is a very direct statement. And while it may seem harsh and directive, it's much clearer and easier to understand. The next tip is checking in regularly. So how you check in is kind of an art form. That's more art than science. But I think we do it anyway in normal speech with anyone for that matter, but we do it maybe more subtly, and I'm asking you to be more intentional about it now. You really are checking in to make sure that your loved one is understanding you. So you're chunking your words much as you can. You're doing all the tips for communication that you're learning now. But it's important as you go along the way to really make sure that your loved one understands what you're saying. If indeed you want to have what we describe as meaningful engagement, how do you, even if it's a 10-minute period or 15-minute period, how do you meaningfully engage someone so that they're really immediate in there? And I'll show you mempics as sort of one way of doing that in a few minutes. So I had said before, decoding language is really difficult. How we do it is the skills live in a part of our brain which is very vulnerable to dementia and particularly to Alzheimer's disease. So you just have to make sure that you're checking in. And if you find that you've lost your loved one, it's important to kind of go back and retrench and be more concrete and start all over again if you can. Here's how I think about it. So if you're a person who's living with dementia, understanding a conversation is like starting a novel on page 100. So you have no context. And So it's really challenging to kind of figure it out. Now, if I asked you to start at page 100 for a novel and start reading, you might be able to figure it out, assuming it's a book you haven't read before, you didn't see the movie or the TV series or whatever based on it. You know, if you have dementia, your cognitive skills are already being compromised. They don't work that well. So it's really difficult to understand the plot or the point that you're making start at the beginning. Repetition is a good thing, even though it can be annoying. If we were in a room together and I said, well, you know, how often do you hear your mom say, when are you coming back, for maybe the 22nd time in the last hour? And so we can see it and we can understand it as a negative thing. But I'd rather you think about it as just a problem-solving strategy from someone who you care about who has dementia. They can't remember it, and they're trying to create a memory groove, and repetition is a way of really doing that. Think about it as a form of communication, ineffective sometimes, rather than a problem. Repetition is actually a good thing. You want to be able to do it, and there are certain strategies that can improve working memory for people who have mild stage and even moderate stage dementia, in the working memory exercise book and things of that sort that would help with that. Okay, those are the 8 great 8 communication tips. Just a couple of caveats here. We take language for granted, don't we? We learn it early in life. It's amazingly nuanced, though. And when we have dementia, language is degraded. The ability to process language, to express language, becomes increasingly challenged. And so it's very important that we are reminded of that when we are talking with someone who we care about, or someone even who isn't a family member or who isn't a friend who has dementia. That's important. If we are visiting a loved one at Kensington, and you come across another resident who has dementia, and you're talking with them, you know, we always say, and this is probably less relevant for you, but certainly relevant for staff, it's really being aware of age of statements, cultural insensitivities, negative stereotypes, because they actually can find their way into communication. Okay, so I was asked to just present for you some resources that you might want to know about. The first thing is the second bullet. Do sign up at enrichvisits.com, which is really a brain health website. It's free for educational emails. And the reason why I say that is that every week, usually several times a week, we send out to this very large group of members just information. It could be about science, could be about memory specifically, it could be about mood functioning in dementia. Once a week, there's always a cognitive exercise. I think that's less for people with dementia, more for their family members. So anyone can sign up for enrichvisits.com, and we'll go to that website in a moment because there are resources for you on there that are free and maybe useful for you. We're often asked by family members who have a loved one with dementia, who are worried about their own forgetfulness, which, by the way, is normal after age 50. We can talk about that later if we have time. There's this cognitive self-assessment. It's free. It's called My Mem Check. It's used a lot in primary care. That's available to you if you're feeling particularly stressed. There's a free measure called the Mood 5, the M5. It's also used very widely. There are resources there. There's something called the Enrich Calculator, another free resource. It's basically a way of identifying, are your everyday behaviors consistent with brain health, so you lower the risk of dementia. it's really a way of just getting some specific information. I had mentioned MEMPICS. MEMPICS is used a lot by Life Enrichment or Activity Program and Senior Living. It's used by family members. And this is, MEMPICS came out of a study that was funded by CMS, the Centers of Medicare and Medicaid. They came to us because they wanted to know if there were materials that would promote meaningful engagement, reduce agitation, partly so that we could use less medication. And MEMPICS is a way of doing that. And it starts, actually, it's very thematic, as you can see, but it starts with a visual cue, a picture. And that's because, as I said before, the visual centers of the brain usually aren't affected until very late into the dementia process, as opposed to language. So, for example, if you wanted to talk about a pet that you had, if you started with a picture of a dog first so that that connection was made, it'd be much clearer. A person could participate more fully in terms of the words, of that. So if you're interested in MEMPICS, you can certainly learn about them on that same website, enrichvisits.com. We wrote a very brief book or guide for family members who struggle. I think we all struggle when we have a loved one with dementia. This is sort of the basic way of understanding the dementia process. We call it the dementia journey. It's just a resource. If you have any interest in that, you can do that. Brain Health as You Age is a book that was written in 2017. I was nominated and won a number of awards for clarity, for explaining things like different kinds of dementia and so forth. I wrote this with Dr. Simmons and Jody Lyons. You can use that as a resource if you want. And then I want to tell you about something that is coming very soon called 15 for Me. It really started as a stress reduction program, and it came out of a lot of science that our center at the BCAT did nationally, trying to understand the stress level of older adults, of caregivers, healthcare givers, and families during COVID. And, as you guys are aware, with COVID, there was a long period of time where we couldn't spend time with our loved ones, and, we're very challenged in that way, and it created a lot of stress. And so one of the tools that was created, evidence-based, published, used widely, that Mood 5, I mentioned that before, the M5 on the Enrich website, was developed. But this program is a way of reducing stress. Science is pretty impressive. I think people who do the program for 4 weeks, they reported between 80 and 90% reduction in stress. That was statistically significant. So you may find out more about that. And if you become a member of Enrich, you'll get information about it anyway. This is it's based on the 3 C's of stress reduction. They're very specific cognitive exercises that improve working memory, that term that we've used many times. Some cardio exercises that you can do in 10 to 15 minutes, hence the term 15 for Me. Centered breathing. And by the way, one of the projects that we're doing, which will show up on this app, it's an app that you can use on a phone or a computer, probably by April, is specifically for people with dementia. We've actually, just finishing the science here, we've been able to create these meditative videos, really, that lower agitation among people with dementia, with working memory in mind. So it's just something for you to kind of think about. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen for a moment. Oh yeah, I was asked to just take you to this one website. So let me do this very, very quickly, and then we can take any questions that you might have. Bear with me for a minute while I just find the site, and then I think we're fine. Okay. So this is the website. So from this website, you will see you can do the Enrich calculator, which is here. You can do my MEM check. This is free. It's a cognitive self-assessment. The Mood 5 is here. can learn about 15 for Me. And those other materials are available here on the bookstore. If you are interested in that, there's a section for individuals and families. You can look at MEMPICs. You can read about them by clicking on them. You can look at the Working Memory Exercise book, less for people with dementia, unless they have mild stage dementia, more for people who are perhaps a bit younger or concerned about protecting their brain as they age. Brain Sharp's another resource. So let me just stop sharing and I can take any questions that anyone might have. Okay, I don't see anything in the chat. Kayla, Alexandra, any questions from your groups?
Dr. Mansbach, hi, it's Alex. Oh, you put it.
Hi,
Thank
Alex.
you. Thank you. Enrichvisits.com. Great. I will pass that along. Thank you.
Sure. Any other questions about communication, about dementia, anything of that sort that I can help you with? Okay, so this is a question. Kayla writes, the tip regarding the main point, can you explain a few more do's and don'ts in depth? Sure, I'm happy to do that. So we are used to talking with a family member, for example, in terms of paragraphs. So if you or if I was actually writing down what you were saying, and normally to someone, it wouldn't be just one sentence most of the time. We often talk in paragraphs. The problem with dementia, in dementia, though, is that a person with dementia can't decode a whole paragraph because it exceeds a person's working memory. It's more likely to cause agitation. That can take the form of just irritability, anxiety, sometimes it's aggression, sometimes it's statements that are like, you know, you think I'm stupid, or any imaginable thing can basically happen. So we think that start with the main point is really, really important. So rather than saying, oh, Mom, I watched this program on TV. I think you really like it. Do you want me to put it on? It would be better to say, let's look at this program together. And then once it's on, you can begin to do, you know, chunking sentences in this way. Suppose you bring something for a family member that she loves to eat, rather than just launching into the, oh, I was at Wegmans or Whole Foods or Giant or Safeway or whatever, and it reminded me of that time when, you know, you used to bake blah, 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 and this really reminded me of it, so here it is. It would be much better to say, look what I brought you, Mom, and start chunking in that way. So it on one hand, people say it improves communication, but it kind of takes some of the richness out of some conversations. But on the other hand, it reduces agitation. So it depends on where your loved one is on this dementia journey. If they're in an earlier stage, you can have a more embellished, more paragraph-centric conversation. But remember, we often, and this is a truism, we as family members and as clinicians often assume that whoever we're speaking with gets us more than they're actually getting us. And many people with dementia who are still verbally fluent give the impression that they're following you, but just because they're verbally fluent doesn't mean that they're actually really processing the conversation. So that's pretty much what I mean by that, Kayla. Okay, so here's a question. If I see that I lost mom during a check-in, can you give an example of how to start over or redirect? I can. And so you can make it thematic to what you've been talking about, or you can change the channel entirely. And I recommend changing the channel entirely and then going back to it. So let me just give you a made up sort of example. Suppose that you're talking to your mom about your daughter, about what she's doing, that she's going to graduate college and she has a job offer and all that. And you look at your mom and you realize she sort of lost it in some way. She doesn't know where you are. You have two choices. You can either say, mom, and make sure that she's making that connection with you. It's like, don't cross the street without looking both ways. Do you remember, and I'm just going to make up the name, Sarah, and just look and see. And then you can kind of, chunk it in that way. Or you can go to a tried and true thing, which is, I'm making this up again, because it may not be your situation, something your mother loves and can follow, like, well, Mom, I see that you still have these flowers on the table. And then once you reestablish a connection, then you can begin to reintroduce the other topic. This reminds me of a question that we often get, which is, how long should my visit be? Where should my visit be? Should it be in the room? Should I take her home? Whatever, all those kinds of questions. So think about these things. You come for a visit, and then when you leave, but your mom or your dad or whoever it is still affected by the visit, even though they may not be able to articulate it. The visit doesn't exactly end after the hour that you're there. I often recommend shorter visits rather than longer visits, so that you don't get to the point of exhaustion. Remember, working memory is less for a person. Their stimulus buffer is compressed. Try to make it shorter if you can. In terms of going out, I did a telemedicine visit today with a woman whose husband has Alzheimer's disease that's advancing pretty quickly. He's a musician by training, and so one of the things that he did is that he did a lot of teaching. And it turns out that there was a performance at the school that he taught. And so the wife said to her, she thought this might be one thing that he could participate in. So she took him in, he couldn't make sense of it. And it turned out to be, pretty negative in some way. So less is more quite often. Okay. Next question. Can you explain a little bit about the different stages of dementia versus the different types of dementia? Does everyone end up at the same point near the end? So let me unpack that just a little bit, and I'll first talk about stages. So what I would want you to understand is that dementia is always progressive. What I mean by that is that over time, a person will get worse, but the progression of decline is not even. Person can go for several years with very little change, and then could have rapid change over a period of a week or two. Everyone is different in how they do it. What they share in common, though, is that dementia is always progressive. And you see this very clearly, perhaps among the clearest, with Alzheimer's disease. It's almost impossible for it not to be, I would argue, to be progressive. That said, we think about it as progressing through three blocks. Mild dementia, which is not mild, right? It's just mild relative to dementia, moderate and severe. Excuse me. And in mild dementia, you see a progression of memory impairments. You begin to see what we call executive impairments. The executive skills are, and this is pretty much an Alzheimer's disease model, are judgment, problem solving, sequencing, set shifting, all that kind of stuff. The CEO, the command and control center of the brain, you begin to see that in years 1, 2, and 3. And that first stage usually lasts about 3 years, give or take. The second stage, this moderate stage, usually begins around years 4 and 5. Again, progresses over about 3 years. And then you begin to see very advanced memory problems. You begin to see very advanced executive skills, or a person can't really problem solve very well, gets easily confused. And then you begin to have more language difficulties. So the grade 8 communication tips is really relevant in any stage, but especially in that moderate stage. And then the final block, the advanced stage or severe stage, usually begins around year 7 and 8. And we think of all these as 3 to 4 year stages, although sometimes people progress more quickly and some people less quickly. Then you begin to see difficulties in what we call ADLs, activities of daily living. Person has toileting difficulties, maybe needs help with bathing, certainly needs help with bathing, maybe help with eating even. And ADLs are different than IADLs. IADLs are instrumental or complex activities of daily living, and they're not things like being able to walk and being able to eat. They're actually more nuanced, like, can you write a checkbook out? You know, can you manage your finances? Could you prepare a meal? Could you do shopping? Those IADLs really become impaired during the moderate stage, and ADLs are more pronounced in the severe stage. But you know, everyone is a little bit different. We think about Alzheimer's disease as idiopathic, sort of more individual specific, but that's generally the case. So that's one way of thinking about stages. In terms of types of dementia, I mentioned there are 10, 11 different types, Alzheimer's disease being the most common. So when we evaluate someone, we are really trying to first see, well, do they have dementia? And I'll define that in a moment. And then if they do, what is a probable cause and what can be done about it? So the way we define dementia, just so you know, is the following. The first thing is that there must be a change for the worse in cognitive functioning. You know, cognitive functioning can be many different things, which I'll describe in a moment, but things have to change for the worse. Second, the hallmark symptom of dementia is difficulty making new memories. Let's not confuse that with remembering something that happened 50 or 60 years ago, because that's stored somewhere else in the brain. We're really talking about a difficulty in making a new memory, right? And so you would say, well, Mom, I'll pick you up at 4 o'clock. And then your mother doesn't remember that. And so that's an example of a memory problem. So in dementia, as I said, a change for the worse in functioning, there must be a memory problem. And there must be at least one other problem with cognition, one of the cognitive domains. And the most common one is these executive skills, the CEO of the brain, the command and control center of the brain. And so you would see that with a person can't seem to like figure out how to take their medications. It's not just remembering it, it's just knowing what to do with it. That begins to, the person becomes less organized. Those are all executive skills. So you would expect that. So that must happen. That's the third thing. Fourth, these problems that are emerging cannot be due to some other condition like a urinary tract infection or pneumonia or too many medications. Well, all those things can cause delirium, which is a change in mental status due to medical factors. And then finally, these symptoms that I'm describing cannot be due to depression or some other psychiatric illness. And depression is interesting because when we get depressed, particularly as we get older, one of the hallmark indications is not just mood, it is memory. Memory becomes worse. So when we treat depression, if someone doesn't have dementia, their memory gets better. So it's important to kind of think about it that way. And then finally, does everyone end up in the same point near the end? If everyone lived long enough, didn't die from something else, while they wouldn't end up exactly in the same place, it would be close. And think about it in this way. Dementia, if it's caused by Alzheimer's disease or strokes, what we call CVAs, they basically disable neurons or brain cells. So you're listening to me and you're engaging a lot of your 80 to 100 billion neurons or nerve or brain cells that you have. They, in these illnesses, they either are destroyed by, in the case of Alzheimer's disease, these proteins. You may have heard of them, beta amyloid or tau, or they may be caused by ischemia or blockage in arteries that you have in vascular dementia, that sort of thing. So the progression is fairly predictable depending on if it's Alzheimer's or something else. And then there are other illnesses. You may have a loved one that has frontal temporal dementia, it presents a little bit differently, or Lewy bodies dementia, and the list goes on. So I'll sum it up in that way, that people are unique, but there are some very predictable patterns of decline. Good questions. Well, are there any other questions that I can answer for you?
I just sent, I believe, our last question.
Okay. How do you have a complex discussion with someone who has dementia? An example might be, why am I taking this medicine? What is this for? And finances. So this is a great question, and no doubt comes from experience. So in some ways I could answer it. It may sound flippant, but I don't mean it in that way, which is, you actually don't have a complex conversation or discussion. You have a simple one. You try to break something that's complex into making it very simple, and try not to confuse memory and the need to repeat with an inability to understand, because they're really, they can be different things. So let's take medication as an example. Why do I have to take this medication? I don't like this medication. I don't know what it does for me. I don't want to take this medication. Why do I have to do it? You want to make that as concrete as possible, which could be, you need it. That's an example. Your doctor ordered it. And if you don't take it, you could feel worse. I mean, that's what I mean by making it really concrete. We have to change our expectations of someone who in the past would be able to understand all these things. Although you may argue maybe didn't need that medication in the past. I don't really know. That said, there actually are some medications where asking you, why am I taking them, does make sense. One of them might be a memory enhancer like Aricept or Namenda or any of a number of other kinds of medications, particularly in moderate stage dementia where there's almost no evidence that they work. So you could have someone who's having nightmares from Aricept, who's in the 7th year of dementia, let's say the Alzheimer's type. It'd be hard to convince me that that medication is helpful. Sometimes people do know that they're having a bad reaction, but the rule of thumb is take something complex, make it simple, even though you might be taking the nuances out of it. Good. Alex, Kayla, any other questions before we end for this evening?
I think that we are good on our end from Falls Church.
Yes, we are good
Okay.
from Reston, and we really appreciate your time.
Yes, thank you very much, Dr.
Happy to do it. Sure, happy to be with you. Have a good evening. Sign up for Enrich, get a bunch of information that you might find useful for you. Okay, thank you very much. Have a nice evening.
Wonderful.
Thank you. Good night.
Good night.
Thank you.